Hey everybody, KC here. So today we have a conversation with David Bucca of Change Foods. And basically Change Foods is in the precision fermentation business, right? What they're doing is basically using microorganisms to create dairy products, but without the need to have like a bunch of cows, right? I have to be honest with you. I don't understand most of this because I haven't taken a science course since 1971. But it's fascinating stuff. It has enormous implications for the dairy industry, for consumers, for retailers who can get involved now. And quite frankly, they position this as being one of the next great disruptions for the food industry, and I totally buy into that. So anyway, I hope you enjoy my conversation. From Change Foods, David Bucca. Well, David Bucca, welcome to Morning Newsbeat.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thrilled. So, okay, I am not a scientist. Last science class I think was probably like 1971. So it's been a long time. So explain to me like I'm a third grader, which is probably a pretty good assumption for the purposes of this conversation. Explain to me exactly what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And we're using and leveraging a technology called, well, what's now called precision fermentation. It used to be called, I guess, historically microbial fermentation. But what that means is we take microorganisms and we can instruct them in certain ways using the latest of technologies to produce specific compounds or ingredients of interest, including things even like biomaterials as well. So it's what it means is we use fermentation, which is like the typical age-old traditional fermentation, like you would find with beer or wine or cheese. But what we're doing is we're actually sort of instructing those microorganisms using biotechnology to, when they're fermenting, to produce specific compounds that we're looking for, of course, which we then purify, we filter away the rest of the fermentation. And what we end up with is a purified version of that particular ingredient. And then we can use it to create other products into the market that are needed, such as cheese and dairy, like what we're focused on.
So the idea is that, at its base is that you're able to create, in this case, cheese,
right,
without any cows getting involved. There's no actual dairy in the creation of these dairy products.
That's the power of this technology in a nutshell, right? So we can actually remove a macroorganism and replace it with a microorganism. Some people refer to it as the second domestication. The first domestication was of animals or macroorganisms. The second domestication, which we're now entering, is of microorganisms. And of course, because of that, they undergo a similar metabolic process. So they convert feedstock or sugars into, for example, in our case, casein, which is the key protein you find in milk that's needed to create cheese, but without the whole animal involved. But the process is very similar on a biological level. We take, sugars from fermentation, we convert that purely into casein. So then you get all of the upside of producing the identical product that consumers are looking for, without the downside of farming, animal agriculture, all the water and inputs that are needed, all the pollution, the methane emissions, the gas emissions, growing a cow for 2 to 3 years, and all of that stuff that comes along with that industrialized system. So that's the power and the transformational potential of precision fermentation.
The idea being that if there are places of agriculture that are, let's say, suffering from drought,
right,
you could still ideally be able to create the same number of dairy products and feed the same number of people or more without drought affecting the output.
And even bigger than that, we've set up, and we made an announcement in November last year, that we're actually building a world first commercial manufacturing facility for between 1.2 million litres of fermentation to 2.4 million litres of fermentation in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. So that's a desert environment, which typically don't have and never had an industrial sector such as dairy. But because of their food security initiatives, they import 90% of their food. This allows them now to create a whole new sector of dairy production locally in a very hot, arid environment, which is typically not suitable for cattle. in a much smaller footprint of land, without all of the hassles that go along with importing cows, for example, and making them graze in very hot environments with lower yields and everything else. So this is the transformational power, is that from a food security perspective, you can set up facilities like this anywhere in the world in a very small footprint and be able to locally produce real bioidentical dairy products. So it's very transformational on the industry level.
So, and again, I apologize for being such an idiot when it comes to this stuff. So when you start with those microorganisms that you're starting with, are they actually being harvested from a cow though? Are you starting from that root material that you're able to take, one cow, harvest the microorganisms, and then create output that might be the equivalent of thousands, if not millions of cows?
So precision fermentation is different. We actually leverage typical fermentation microorganisms. So yeast, for example, bacteria. So they don't have to be from a cow or the animal at all. All we're doing is taking the gene from a cow, and we're inserting that into the yeast. So think about beer brewing and taking like a brewer's yeast.
Right.
And then it's fermenting in large tanks, and then you end up with alcohol as a byproduct, which is what we want in beer. Or you think about baker's yeast, where you take yeast, you use it as part of the bread making process, and it produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which leavens bread. But we're taking that same yeast and we're now instructing it with whichever gene sequence we're interested in, and then enabling that microorganism as it's fermenting and doing its regular fermentation to also produce and express that particular product of interest. And then, as I explained earlier, what we're then doing is isolating that ingredient away from the rest of the fermentation. So we're purifying it away. So no cows or animals that are involved at all in the project. It's all done synthetically using what's available in terms of the DNA sequences of the genes that have been mapped in the past before. So for example, I think it was in 2008, they did the full genome sequence of a cow. So we know exactly what are the sequences and then the genes available to express different metabolic processes of that cow. And then we're using that to our advantage here to produce the same ingredients. It's slightly different to cellular agriculture. So some people may have heard of cell-based meats, for example. That's slightly different, where you actually start with a biopsy from an animal and then you recreate those cells. But that's a cell-based or cellular agriculture process. What we're doing is a fermentation process.
And so is there well, as you know, genetic engineering is somewhat controversial.
Sure.
The people who object to genetic engineering, do they have a natural inclination to object to what you're doing, or is it different?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on people's take on. I mean, we just see it as a technology. It's a tool. Tools can be used for good, and tools can be used for bad. So genetic engineering is a tool we can start doing things like this, which are very transformational, that we haven't been able to do before. The advantage of what we're doing, though, is that the end product itself, the protein that we're producing, is not genetically modified. The protein is identical to what comes from milk. All we're genetically modifying is the organism to be able to produce that ingredient, but then we separate away that organism from the end product. So if you like, genetic modification is used as a processing aid, not in the final product itself. So the final output is arguably genetically or is not genetically modified. It's not a GMO, but it was used in the process of producing it. So then it comes down to the regulators in each country, which consider this differently, and also people's perceptions of how they're comfortable with consuming products like this. But arguably, I would say that it's identical to the same output. And in fact, it's more pure than what you would typically find within milk as well, and doesn't have all of the downsides. It doesn't have lactose. We don't use antibiotics. We don't use hormones in our production process. And so you can still produce the same product, and if not better, we can have a better, purer product without all the downsides and baggage that comes along with industrialized animal agriculture.
Explain to me why it doesn't have lactose.
Because all we're producing is the protein. The protein's
Okay.
the key unlock, which we need to produce the cheeses that we're looking for today. And lactose in milk is a sugar source. It's a carbon source. So we can formulate our final products without lactose, right? So we can use other sugars, such as galactase or glucose or whatever's needed in that product, that final product formulation. So therefore, we can still produce the same experience from a consumer level and produce the same cheese, but without the downsides of what come along with conventional milk.
So what does that mean? So I'm mildly lactose intolerant. There's information in the morning news feed. May not have, didn't have it, may not need to have. So I drink lactate milk.
Right.
But you're saying that the milk that you would produce, would it could replace regular milk,
Right.
while still being, but would actually be fine for somebody like me. So how does it get labeled? I know that, and I guess that's again a regulatory issue, depending on the country. But would you imagine that you'd need a special section? I mean, you have your almond milks, you have your lactose-free milks, you have your oat milks, you have your dairy, cow milks.
Yes.
Would you imagine that it would be likely that your milks, let's say, would require their own section in a way, would have to be labeled as being different?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the things that we've been working on from the start is we're actually sort of creating a new category of foods. The current nomenclature and terminology that's used to differentiate what we're working on with precision fermentation is animal-free. So it's animal-free milk or animal-free cheese or animal-free mozzarella, etc. However, it really comes down to the consumer and the end consumer and their willingness to adopt and understand what that means. So there is some work being done in a sort of alliance that we've recently announced called the Precision Fermentation Alliance, where we're working with 8 other startups in this space to sort of align on things such as standardized naming and conventions. So it's clear to the consumer what it is. And what it isn't. We stand by the fact that this is not from a cow, so it's in some ways not from a traditional dairy making process. But at the same time, we want to highlight the features and the fact that it is identical to the end product as well. So this is where retailers and consumers can play a really critical role in terms of understanding the positioning of this in market, right? And how we best place this to create transparency and clarity and show the upsides of this new type of food that we're creating.
Does the way you're engineering this, does that mean it's going to last longer? And I ask that because I'm always interested by the idea that when I buy a half a gallon of lactate milk, it usually has an expiration date that's 5-6 weeks out, unlike regular milk, because I guess it's lactose that partially makes creates an earlier expiration date. Does this mean your products actually will last longer, either both on the shelf and in the consumer's home?
They can do, yes, because it really comes down to the cleanliness of the production process, right? So typically when you look at conventional dairy processing, there's a lot of contamination involved, right? There's a lot of fecal activity in the production of dairy. And so that's where a lot of antibiotics have to be used. And because of that, there's a lot of, contaminating microorganisms in the dairy industry, which then shorten the shelf life. You can think of things like pasteurization techniques, such as, ultra heat treatment, which is probably similar to lactate that you refer to. They've probably gone through a UHT process to then extend shelf life. But we don't necessarily need to do that because we're creating the same product in a much cleaner, more sterile environment. If you think about like a beer brewery, that's what it's going to look like for us. And so because of that, there's less contamination, there's less bad microbes, and so the shelf life is naturally extended. So instead of a milk that expires in days, for us it will be weeks.
Does that mean that while obviously I assume you couldn't call yourself an organic milk, but you will share many of the characteristics that organic milk might have, like no antibiotics, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there's lots of stringency around organic labeling and the requirements for being able to meet that, which I don't think we would meet. But there's a whole new suite of benefits that come along with this technology that yet have to be explored and explained, to the consumer as well. And I think once again, how we work with retailers and position this in market is really critical, right? So the other advantage, I mean, health is a big thing that drives a lot of sales in the alternative space right now, but sustainability is becoming more important in terms of the consumer's mindset as well. And so we do have a huge amount of sustainability benefits in terms of reduced water usage, land usage, greenhouse gas emissions, and all of that comes along with this technology as well. So highlighting some of those additional benefits, even sort of in my mind, surpasses some of those sort of health claims and organic claims that the conventional consumers might be looking for today.
Yeah, I was reading some of that. I mean, some of this. So, what about? I mean, to what extent? I mean, well, first of all, where are you in the development process at this point? I mean, you've got this thing going in Abu Dhabi, but where are you in terms of being able to get to the point of mass production?
Yeah, so scalability is one of the critical constraints, I guess, in this whole industry at the moment, just because a lot of this technology has stemmed over from pharmaceutical applications and it's now moving more heavily into food. And so food, when you think of dairy, it's a very commoditized price point. So really it's all cost driven. So if we could sell dairy at 20x the cost, then we could commercialize today. But of course, one of the challenges is, well, you have to build scalability to enable the cost to come down.
Bring down the cost. Okay.
Exactly. And so that's why it was important for us to strategically build our own commercial manufacturing facility, specifically geared towards food production. And that will enable us to come down the cost curve significantly. And so we're in the process of what we call scale up. So, we've got a process that we run at small scale right now. And we've been over the last year working with one of our partners in Asia to continue scaling up our process to reduce the cost. And eventually, once our own facility is built, we will commercialize from that facility globally. And that's a common trait for most of the precision fermentation startups as well, is finding that scalable pathway to market. The other thing worth mentioning, though, is that this isn't only from pharmaceutical applications. It's actually been used in food for decades. So we're already consuming products of this technology in our foods. And in fact, even within cheese and dairy. So 90% of cheeses made worldwide today are made using microbial rennet or non-animal rennet. So if you look at the back of a packet of cheese, for example, you'll often see microbial rennet or non-animal rennet. And that is the enzyme that's added to milk at the start of the fermentation process to curdle the milk into curds and whey. And that's been produced synthetically from our technology since the early 1990s. So we're already eating this technology in our cheese products today. All we're doing is taking that same technology, and rather than using it for an enzyme, we're now extending it to the protein itself. And once people realize that and make that connection, it's actually a no-brainer. It's like, okay, well, we're already consuming this safely. And it's used for many other things such as antibiotics, colorings, flavorings. It's used in the food industry quite broadly.
I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that's going to happen as for this to roll out, in addition to bringing the price down, would be, just simple education of consumers.
Yes.
I think there is a, at least in this country, there is a somewhat there are high suspicion levels about science just in general, right? I mean, people don't trust science the way people used to trust science. So but if people can be educated about this, that will be critical to acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's part of the reasons why, marketing is so critical, to be able to explain to the consumer in as simple language as possible what it is that this product is and the benefits of this product and why they should be consuming it. And I think there's just a lot of inefficiencies in our food system right now, which less than 3% of people are aware of. So there's been a recent poll being conducted to understand the impacts and sustainability impacts of food in particular. And less than 3% of people realize, in the US at least, the impact of that food has on the environment and generally speaking, globally. And there's a lot of education to be done on that as well. So then you can sell the advantages of why we need to start thinking about recreating food in far more sustainable and efficient ways. And that, education can work on multiple levels. So, educating as an industry, but also then on the consumer front piece as well. So, we've brought on board Irina Gary as our chief marketing officer for a couple of years ago. She's been really instrumental as well as helping understand and relay that messaging with the industry partners as well. And for us to speak with one voice, to showcase the advantages and to work with on the consumer level to educate people as to why this is needed and why it's so important.
Am I right that the first place that you would probably be able to have a really move the needle will be places, whether it's in Africa or Asia, the Middle East, where the weather is inhospitable towards creating a dairy industry? Whether because of drought or heat or whatever it happens to be, that if you can start giving people who might not have access to fresh dairy that kind of access, that's the first place you can move the needle, as opposed to a place like the United States where there's a lot of dairies. I mean, right, we got a shortage of eggs right now, but largely you don't see milk shortages or butter shortages and things like that.
No, I think it's all of the above. I mean, there's different consumers are driven by different needs. So when you think about the places that don't typically have dairy, there's an absolute reason and case value proposition as to why we need to be there. But secondly, then when you think of places like the US, the alternative dairy sector is increasing, right? So naturally, and there's strong limitations in the ability of current alternatives to meet the needs of the consumer from a cheese product, for example. So when you think of a cheese, you think of good nutrition. You think of a pizza cheese, you think of great, texture, elasticity, that sort of experience that you have. And a lot of the alternatives that exist in the market today do not cut it. This is why what we're producing is the real thing. It's real protein. It's the real casein that you find that unlocks and solves for that current performance issue with current alternatives. So there is a huge consumer base that are looking for a better alternative to dairy, because a lot of people are lactose intolerant. A lot of people are looking for alternatives naturally, and there's an organic growth in that sector regardless. And so we will definitely appeal to that consumer that's looking for a better alternative, that's looking for better nutrition, because a lot of the current cheese alternatives have 0% protein, for example. We can add full amount of protein back into their cheese products. And what we're creating is not actually a substitute for dairy, it's a replacement for dairy. So then if you think about just the regular cheese consumer, then suddenly if you've got two cheeses side by side, which are almost identical in taste and performance, maybe the cost will eventually be identical as well, if not cheaper on our side, because we don't have all the inputs and the burden of all of the inefficiencies. But let's just assume that they're identical, but then one has all the health benefits and the sustainability benefits, then really the choice is quite simple. The switching threshold is minimized. And of course, there is a generational difference as well. Younger consumers, Gen Zs, millennials, are more open and flexible to try different products created differently that have these added advantages. When you think about the older generations, they're probably a little bit less sensitive to change and to try.
I won't even take that personally.
No, but that's the reality of the situation, right? So I think, there's a huge market. Cheese is increasing. It's not stable. It's not cutting in. It's an increasing category. Cheese and dairy is still going up and up and up. But when you think about, well, how do we produce and cater for this increase in demand? Then do we continue to expand farming? Do we continue to continually intensify animal agriculture, which is already quite a pretty nasty industry when you think about the treatment of animals, how intensified it all is, the outputs, the pollution, and everything else that goes along with that. And it's on a very fine margin, and really all of the subsidies have to kick in from the government to keep that industry afloat. So when you start thinking about all of these factors which are converging, yet you have an increase in demand, that's where you have to start thinking about the benefits of what we're doing, because this can complement dairy production. It's not necessarily going to remove dairy production. We have to create more cheese and more dairy. How can we use this to unburden the intensification of animal agriculture while still providing products of equal value in the market that consumers are looking for? And I think that's really the strong business case for what we're doing and why it's so valuable.
Okay, last question. Retailers are watching this right now. Suppliers are watching this right now. What can they do? What should they be doing? And the last part of that is, how do they reach out to you if they want to find out more?
Sure. I mean, I'm really open to working vertically across the whole supply chain. And of course, retailers are the ultimate touch point of where consumers really interact with the products. And therefore, I think they're of critical importance to the success of any new category, let alone what we're doing. And I think we don't want to have this lost in a sea of cheese and other alternatives. There needs to be some more strategic partnerships in place to understand, well, how can we work together on the retail front to position this product correctly, to educate the consumer to the points that you mentioned earlier. And I think we'd love to work with retailers on that front well before we have a product in market, which we're expecting to have larger retail presence in 2025 or 2026. But before then, we'd love to work with a retailer more strategically on how do we actually work on this product together so the consumer understands it. How can we create tastings? How can we create a novel experience to celebrate the benefits of what we're working on? And this is a really transformational technology. This is taking dairy into a new era, which I think will have a huge amount of benefits moving forward, and including things such as sustainability, right? So from a retailer point of view as well, when we start thinking about scope 3 emissions and all these things that are coming down the pipeline, we can help also sell a story of sustainability and how we are transforming food using innovation in a way that we can still provide people what they're looking for, but in a far more efficient and better way. And I think, retailers play a huge role in that. So, we'd love to chat with anyone, any retailer.
How do they reach out to you? What's the best way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, via our website, changefoods.com, there's hello@changefoods.com is our general email address. So we'd be very willing to work with retailers that are open to also differentiate. I think this is a great opportunity for retailers to provide offerings to their consumer base that people are looking for. Certainly in California, we've got a huge amount of data to say that the flexitarian market, which is basically the meat reducer market, people that are driven by sustainability, that are looking for better offerings and products. There's a huge amount of consumers. I mean, we get emails all the time saying that we've got so many consumers that are excited to try what we're producing. And I think, speed is really critical, and we'd love to work with retailers that want to differentiate and have something different in their offerings. So yeah, please reach out to us.
Well, listen, David, I really appreciate your time. This is fascinating stuff. I think I understand about 20% of it, but that's 20% I didn't understand before we talked. So good luck. I'll make sure I'll make sure I put a link into your website on Morning Newsbeat. And good luck. I hope we can check in again down the road and find out how things are going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
Take care.
Thank you.